The groom stopped halfway down the aisle. He turned around, he looked at the woman he was about to marry, and he said it out loud, in front of 300 people. "I can't. Look at her. I can't do it." And then he walked out. And nobody, not one single person in that entire room, stood up to go after her. Her name was Ama Boateng. She was 28 years old. She had come to Seoul from Kumasi 6 years earlier with 2 suitcases and $400, and she had built a life here out of nothing but her own 2 hands. And on that Saturday morning, she was standing at the top of an aisle in the Grand Sejong Hotel in a wedding dress she had made herself. 11 months, that dress took her. Every night after work, in a rented back room in the fabric district, with her fingers cracking from the thread. Ivory silk, a neckline she had drawn 6 different ways before she got it right. And around the hem, running all the way around, hand-stitched, a border of Ashani gold, because her grandmother had once told her that a Ghanaian woman never walks into a new life without carrying the old one somewhere on her body. She was still holding her flowers when Mensah stopped walking. He did not make it to the door. He got as far as the 3rd row, and that was where his mother was sitting, and that was where he stopped, and everybody heard him because by then that ballroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. Annie Comfort stood up, gold at her ears, gold at her wrists, a head wrapped the color of a sunset, and she took her son's arm the way a mother takes a child's arm when she has finally been proven right. "Look at her, Derek," she said. "She is a fat girl in a dress she sewed herself. You are Mensah. You cannot marry that." And then the 2 of them walked out of the room together, and the double doors swung shut behind them, and 300 people sat in their seats and looked at the floor and at their phones and at the backs of the heads in front of them, and not one of them moved. Ama did not cry. People always expect that part. She did not cry. She stood there at the top of that aisle in a dress that had taken her 11 months, and she felt something very quiet happen inside her chest, which was the sound of a thing she had suspected her whole life finally being confirmed out loud, in public with witnesses. That she was allowed. Never chosen. Allowed. And then at the very back of the ballroom, a man stood up. He had been standing at the back for 20 minutes. Nobody had noticed him. He was wearing a charcoal suit with no tie and the top button open, and he had a face that did not move, and the moment he began walking, 3 of the hotel staff along the back wall went absolutely rigid because they knew who he was, and everybody who worked in that building knew who he was. He walked the entire length of that aisle, and he did not hurry. Not once. He did not look at Ama. He looked at the guests. And when he reached the front of the room, he turned around and spoke to all 300 of them in a voice that was not loud at all. And every person there heard every word. "The reception is paid for," he said. "The room is mine. Anyone who would like to stay is welcome to stay." Then he turned to Ama Boateng, and he looked at her properly for the first time, and he said 11 words. "Paperwork was filed for a marriage in this building today. I'll marry her." And Ama Boateng, standing in the wreckage of the worst morning of her entire life, looked this stranger dead in the eye, and she said no. She said it clearly. She said it so the back row could hear it. Then she put her flowers down on the empty chair beside her, and she picked up the hem of a dress that had taken her 11 months, and she walked out of that ballroom on her own 2 feet, past 300 silent people, with her back completely straight. And what nobody in that room knew, not Derek, not his mother, not a single guest, and least of all Ama herself, was that the man who had just offered to marry her had been quietly keeping her alive for 6 years. Before we go any further, I want to say welcome. If you're new here, this is Afro Korean Stories Empire, and this is the kind of story we tell. The kind where somebody gets left and left publicly, and it takes the whole rest of the story to understand why it had to happen that way. If you feel something building in your chest already, subscribe and stay with us because what is coming is worth every minute. Now let me tell you who that man was. His name was Kong Min-ho, and 3 days after that wedding, he was sitting in the back office of a shuttered noodle restaurant in the east of the city, with a book open on the table in front of him. The book mattered more than anything else in this story, so I want you to see it clearly. Navy cloth binding, worn soft at the corners, about the size of a hardback novel. And the first 80 pages of it were not in his handwriting. They were in his mother's. Inside that book was the name of every man who had ever died working for the Kong organization. And underneath each name, the family, the widow, the children, school fees, rent, medicine, what they were owed, and for how long, and the answer to how long was always the same. For life. 406 families. Kang Min-ho had never missed a single payment in 13 years. That was the thing about him that people got wrong. He did not think of himself as a criminal. He thought of himself as the last man in Seoul who kept his word. And that is exactly why he was the most frightening man in that city. Because a man who is angry can be reasoned with, and Kang was never angry. To him, violence was not a temper. Violence was arithmetic. He did the sum, he arrived at the number, and then he carried out the number calmly, with no heat in it at all. Across the table from him that afternoon was a man called Ryu, who ran money on the east side, and who had been quietly taking from that family fund for 19 months. Kang did not shout. Kang did not stand up. He opened the book, and he turned it around so Ryu could see the page, and he read 4 names out loud. He read the first name, and the widow's name, and the ages of her 2 children, which were 9 and 6. He read the amount. He read the number of months. He read the second name, then the third, then the fourth. A boy of 11 with a hearing problem who needed an operation in the spring. The room was completely silent while he read. Somewhere out on the street, a scooter went past. The extractor fan over the cold stove was still running from years ago, and nobody had ever turned it off. Then Kang closed the book and folded his hands on top of it, and explained to Ryu what was going to happen next. For nights, he said, 4 doors. You will go to each house yourself. Young will stand behind you. You will put the money into their hands, and you will tell them, in your own words, what you took from their children and why they went without. And then Kang said, on the 5th night, we will talk about the rest of it. He did not say what the rest of it was. Ryu started to speak. Kang looked at him, and Ryu stopped speaking, and that was the end of the meeting. Now here is the part that matters, and I need you to hold on to it because Ama Boateng did not know this and would not know it for a long time. The reason Ryu got audited was not the skimming. 3 weeks earlier, somebody had come to Kang with a piece of information. That Ryu had been leaning hard on a Ghanaian seamstress in the Dongdaemun fabric district over $11,000 of debt, sending men to her shop. Twice. Kang had listened to that, and he had said nothing at all, and then he had ordered a full audit of every account Ryu had ever touched. You know that now. She did not know it for another 6 weeks. 2 nights after that, there was a second meeting, and this one I will tell you plainly, because the plainness is the point. A man called Beck had put his hands on a woman who worked in a bar under Kang's protection. Kang met him at a small table in the corner of a closed restaurant, just the 2 of them and 1 glass of water. Kang asked Beck to put his hand on the table. Beck did it because you did, and Kang laid his own hand flat on top of it. Not hard. He did not grip. He simply put his hand down and left it there. And then he started asking questions. How was the business? How was the lease on the second unit? How was Beck's sister, who had been unwell in the winter? He asked all of it politely, and he seemed genuinely interested, and he waited for each answer. He never pressed harder. Not once. He just did not let go. The water glass sat there sweating in the warm room, and after a while a line of condensation ran off the base of it and spread across the wood until it reached their 2 hands and pooled around them. Beck's breathing changed. It got shallow, then fast, then something else. He was a big man, and he began to make a sound in his throat that was not a word. Kang's breathing did not change at all. That is the entire scene. Nothing broke. Nothing needed to break. And when Kang finally lifted his hand and stood up, Beck stayed sitting at that table for a very long time after the door had closed. Remember that. Remember exactly how that looked, because you're going to see it one more time before this story is finished, and when you do, you're going to want it. 3 days after her wedding did not happen, Ama Boateng went to find him. Not because she was rescued. Understand that. Ama had never been rescued in her life, and she did not expect to start now. She went because her landlord had terminated the lease on her back room by text message. She went because the wedding had eaten everyone she had saved in 4 years. She went because Ryu's men had suddenly stopped coming around, and she did not know why. And in her experience, when men like that go quiet, it is not because they have forgotten you. And she went because there was a cardboard box under her work table with her grandmother's unfinished cloth folded inside it, and a visa in her passport with 14 months left on it. She found him in an office above a car showroom. She had rehearsed the whole way there. And when she sat down across from him, she did not say thank you, and she did not say hello. She took a folded receipt out of her pocket because that was the only paper she had had that morning, and she read out her conditions. 1 year, she said. Then it ends, and neither of us owes the other anything. Separate rooms. No dashing. I keep working. I keep my own name. And everyone this costs you, I pay back. All of it. I will want that written down. Her voice was completely level while she read it. Her hands were shaking so badly, she had to hold the receipt with both of them. Kang Min-ho listened to all of it without moving. Then he reached into his jacket and took out a pencil, an ordinary yellow pencil, sharpened by hand, and he took the receipt from her, and he wrote one more line on it in small, neat handwriting. Then he turned it around so she could read it. You eat sitting down. Ama looked at that sentence for a long time. She did not understand it. She could not think of one reason on earth why a man like that would write that. She signed it anyway, and here's what she did not know. 5 weeks earlier, that man had watched her from the back of a ballroom for 20 minutes. And she was not the first thing he had noticed about her. The first thing he had noticed was that during the pre-wedding reception, while 150 people sat at tables eating, Ama Boateng had stood by the wall near the door with a plate in her hand, eating quickly on her feet, the way you eat when nobody has ever once told you that a chair was for you. They were married on a Tuesday morning at a district office, in a room with plastic chairs and a fake plant. It took 11 minutes. Jung stood as his witness. Grace stood as hers and cried the entire time, loudly, and then apologized to the registrar in Korean and then cried again. And then Ama Boateng moved into an apartment on the 19th floor of a building in Hannam with a view over the river. And the story became the thing it was always really about, which was a woman slowly learning what it feels like to live in a house where you're not required to earn your place. It did not go well at first. I want to be honest about that. He left before 6 every morning and came back after 11 at night. They passed each other in the hallway like two people in a hotel. And Ama, who had spent her whole life making herself useful so that she would be kept, had absolutely no idea what to do with a man who did not want anything from her. So she talked. That was her thing when she was nervous. She filled the air. She would say something about the weather, and he would not answer. And so she would say something about the traffic, and he would not answer. And she would go to bed at night lying on her back in the dark thinking, you sounded like a fool. Why can you not just be quiet? And the thing was, he was not being cold. He simply had no instinct at all to rescue silence. In his world, silence was normal, and men who filled it were usually lying. Then one evening in the 3rd week, she came out of her room, and he was at the counter reading something, and she opened her mouth to say something about the rain, and she just did not. She got a glass of water instead. She stood near the door and drank it. He kept reading. Neither of them said anything for about 4 minutes. And when she went back to her room that night, she realized her shoulders had come down for the first time since she had moved in. That was the first thing. Here is the second. She apologized for everything. Constantly. Sorry for the noise. Sorry, I used the kitchen. Sorry, I will move. And one night she said sorry for taking a clean towel, and Kang Min-ho put down what he was holding and said, sharply, at genuine volume, stop apologizing in your own house. And then the room went completely still because he had raised his voice, and he never raised his voice, not at anyone, not for anything, and both of them stood there in that kitchen looking at each other, understanding at exactly the same moment that something in this man had already been changed by her, and neither of them had agreed to it. He said, quieter, I am sorry. That was not for you. She said, I know. And here is the third thing, and this is the one that mattered. In the 5th week, Ama came home late from the fabric district and made herself rice and stood in her usual place near the door to eat it. And there was a chair there, an ordinary dining chair from the set of 6 by the table. Somebody had picked it up and carried it across the room and set it down about 6 inches from where she always stood, facing slightly outward, the way you place a chair for a person and not the way you place a chair for a room. Nobody said anything about it. Not that night. Not ever. She stood there holding a bowl of rice, and she looked at that chair for a very long time. And then she sat down in it, and she ate her food sitting down, alone, in a quiet apartment, and she did not know why her eyes were stinging. She offered to make him a suit. It was the only currency she had, and she wanted the debt to be smaller. He said yes, which surprised her. So on a Thursday evening, she cleared the dining table and laid out her chalk and her notebook, and she asked him to stand in the middle of the floor with his arms slightly away from his sides, and she took the measuring tape from around her neck. Now, I want to slow down here because this is the moment the whole story turns, and It is very small, and if you blink you will miss the size of it. She measured across his shoulders first. That one is easy. You stand behind a person and you go from point to point and you do not have to touch them much at all. Then the arm, from the shoulder to the wrist bone. And for that she had to hold his wrist, and his wrist was warm, and she wrote the number down. And then the chest. And for the chest, you have to bring the tape all the way around a person from behind, both arms close, and hold the tape at the front while you read it. So she stepped in behind Kang Min-ho, and she brought her arms around him, and her forearms came against the cotton of his shirt, and she could feel the heat of him through it. And she said the thing she said to every client she had ever measured in her entire life, which was, breathe normally. And he could not. His chest would not do it. He held it, and then he let it go too fast, and then he held it again, and the number moved every time, and she had to say a second time more quietly, breathe normally, and he still could not. She counted 3 false starts before she got a number she could use. Neither of them said one single word about it. He did not turn around. She stepped back and she wrote the measurement in her notebook, and then she looked at what she had written, and she could not read her own handwriting, so she wrote it again. Then she said, "That's everything. Thank you." And he said, "Thank you." And he went into his study and closed the door. And Ama Boateng walked into her room and sat down on the floor with her back against the door and put both hands flat on the carpet. And she stayed there in the dark for a very long time, because there's a specific kind of terror that arrives when you realize you have started to feel something, and you have felt it before, and the last time you felt it, it was a man who loved you completely in private and would not say your name in public. 7 years ago, Kamasi, a man named Kofi who was warm and funny and kind, and who never once introduced her to his friends. In a wedding, where one of them shook her hand and said, "Ah, so you are the cousin." And Kofi standing right there, not saying anything. He had cried, later. He had been sincere. And he had said the sentence she had never been able to get out of her head. "I do love you. I just cannot carry what people will say." So no, tenderness behind a closed door meant nothing to Ama Boateng. She had already had that. She had had a whole 2 years of it. That was the wound. Not that she was rejected, that she was loved in private and denied in public. And that is why, in a very quiet apartment on the 19th floor, a good man being gentle with her where nobody could see it did not make her happy. It made her frightened. Across the city, a card game was happening in the back of a laundry, and an old man in a heavy suit with reading glasses on a cord was shuffling a deck and asking a question that sounded like nothing. His name was Shin Ho-jin. He was 51. He had served Kang Min-ho's father for 20 years before Kang was old enough to shave, and he had built that organization with his own hands through the worst decade it ever had, and then a 26-year-old had inherited it because of a surname. He had never once complained. 13 years of loyal, excellent service. So when Shin dealt the cards that night and said, without looking up, "So who is she?" to him, really it did not sound like anything at all. And Young, who had known Kang since they were boys, said, "Nobody. It is paperwork. It is a hotel booking that went wrong." Shin nodded and set the deck down. "Of course," he said. "That is what I thought." And both men sat there knowing that the other one was lying. It was a Sunday when she found the coat. She was cleaning, because she always cleaned when she could not sit still, and she opened a wardrobe in the spare room, and there was a man's overcoat folded on the shelf. Old, very good wool, the kind they do not make in that weight anymore. Worn thin at both elbows. She picked it up to fold it properly, and she turned back the left sleeve, and she stopped breathing, because there was a repair in that sleeve. A tear along the seam, mended from the inside, doubled and locked, the stitch running back on itself so it can never open again. That is a Kamasi stitch. Her grandmother taught her that stitch when she was 11 years old. There were maybe 6 people in the whole of Seoul who could do it, and she was one of them. She had done this. She just could not remember doing it. And then she did. Her first winter in Korea. 22 years old, no friends, sleeping in the back of fabric shop, working for a man who never paid her on time. And on the cold afternoons, an old Korean woman used to come in and stand near the door where the heater was. Very thin, gray coat. Ama did not know then that she was sick, but she knows now. She had a man's overcoat with her, and she asked about the price of a repair, and when she heard the price she smiled politely and said she would think about it, and Ama said, "No, give it to me, it is nothing, 10 minutes. And there was something else Ama did on that first afternoon, and she had genuinely forgotten it, the way you forget things that cost you nothing. The old woman had been standing by the door, And Ama had dragged a chair across the floor from the corner of the shop and put it down beside her, and said the only words of Korean she knew at that point, which were "Anjaseo." "Please sit." And the woman sat. And she came back many times that winter, and they never once learned each other's names. Kong Minho came home that Sunday evening and found his wife sitting on the floor of his apartment, holding his mother's coat. And so he sat down on the floor across from her, which he had never done in that apartment in his life, and he told her the rest of it. That her name was Mina, that she died 6 weeks after that winter ended, that she had been sick for a year and had never told him because she knew what he was and she did not want to be one more thing he had to manage, that he was 3 streets away in a meeting when it happened, that he could have left the meeting, that he did not leave the meeting, that he arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after, and that nobody had been holding her hand, that when he went through her things he found this coat, mended in a stitch he did not recognize, and that in the ledger, in the last entry she ever made, in handwriting that had gone unsteady by then, she had written something that was not a name and was not a debt. Just a note about a Ghanaian girl in the fabric district who fixed a coat for nothing and who brought her a chair. It took him 19 months to find her. He has known exactly where she is for 4 years. The reason nobody has ever robbed her shop in that district is that everybody in that district knows better. The reason Ryu was audited was that Ryu leaned on her. He owns the Grand Sejong Hotel. 11 months ago, a junior manager brought him a discount request for a ballroom booking, and he saw the name Boateng on the form and approved it personally and did not think about it again until the morning of the wedding, when he came to stand at the back of the room and watch her be happy. And then he stood there for 20 minutes, while a man walked away from her and a room full of people looked at the floor, trying to decide whether he had any right at all to put himself into the life of a woman who had never asked him for one single thing. Now, go back. Go back through everything you have just been told. The chair in the kitchen. The 4th condition written in pencil on the back of a receipt. 11 words in a ballroom that sounded like a business transaction. None of it was a rescue. It was a man paying back the only kindness his mother received in the last winter of her life. He had been carrying it alone for 6 years, and he had never told anybody, and he was never going to. Pause it here, just for a second. If this story is doing something to you right now, tap subscribe and send this to the one person you know who will feel it exactly the way you're feeling it. A sister, your best friend, the one who lives for stories where love comes in through the wrong door. And type "I am enjoying it" down in the comments, so I know you're still with me. Thank you for staying, because from here it gets very hard, and then it gets very beautiful. He started saying her name properly. That was the first thing that changed. He had been saying Miss Boateng for months. And then one evening in the kitchen, he said Ama, with the weight on the first part, the way it is actually said, the way her grandmother said it. She put her hand flat on the counter. She had to. Her legs had stopped being reliable. They started eating together. He came home before 9. He never explained why. She put her grandmother's cloth out on his dining table one night and unrolled the whole thing and told him about it. That it was a pattern called Imada, which means it has never happened before, and that you wear it when a thing is being done for the first time. And she told him the rule, that you do not finish your own cloth. Somebody who loves you finishes it for you. That is what it is for. That is the entire point of it. He asked her why hers was unfinished. She said because Nana died in Kumasi 4 years ago, and there was nobody left who knew how. And then there was a night in that kitchen at 2 in the morning when neither of them could sleep, and she was sitting in the chair he had moved, and he was standing by the window, and they talked about absolutely nothing for 2 hours. Her mother, winters in Seoul, whether a shop could survive on that street. Nothing happened. He did not touch her. Nobody said a word about anything. But neither of them left. That is the thing. Twice she said, "I should sleep," and twice she stayed exactly where she was, and both of them knew it. And at 10 past 4, he said her name once, just her name, and she said, "I know." Shin Ho-jin made his move 8 days later, and it was not what anybody expected. He did not attack. He called a sit-down of every senior man in the organization, and he stood up at the head of the table with a folder, and he opened the accounts in front of everybody, and he made his case calmly, with paper. And this is the part that is uncomfortable, because Shin was not lying. 406 families, he said, paid forever, out of an operation with income that has not grown in 9 years, run by a man who will not enter the businesses that would fund it, because his mother would not have approved. I have done the arithmetic. In 8 years, 10 at the outside, this book cannot be paid. And when it fails all at once, and 400 widows knock on doors that do not open. And now, he said, he has married a foreign woman he met at somebody else's wedding, for no reason any of us can name. That is not romance. That is a man making decisions with the wrong organ, and we will all pay for it. And Kang Min-ho stood up and won that room. He won it completely. He put his hand on that Navy book, and he told 30 men that the day this organization stops paying its debt is the day it becomes something he will not run. And one by one, they stood with him. All of them. Shin accepted it. With dignity. He shook Kang's hand in front of everybody and went home. It was over. Everyone breathed. And then, 4 nights later, Ama Boateng sat down at the kitchen table with the audit papers that had come out of that meeting, and she put on her reading glasses, and she started doing the maths on the back of a piece of pattern paper. Because here's what nobody had thought about. Ama had been running an impossible budget her entire adult life. She had been sending money to Kumasi every month for 6 years out of wages that could not carry it. She was very, very good at this, and she got the same number Shin got. She sat in that kitchen at 1 in the morning, and she understood the whole shape of it at once. He was going to fail. Not this year, but he was going to fail. And the only reason it was holding together at all was that every man in that organization believed he was untouchable. And the fastest way in the world to prove that a man is not untouchable is to take the one thing he is afraid to lose, which was her. It had been her since the day she signed a receipt. So Ama Boateng did the reasonable thing, the correct thing, the thing that broke her heart in half. She wrote it out by hand at that table. She said she was grateful. She said she was sorry. She said, "I have been the thing that makes a man weak once before, and I will not do it to you." She got the annulment papers out of the drawer where she had kept them since the district office. And she put the letter and the papers on the seat of the chair he had moved for her, because she could not bring herself to put them anywhere else in that apartment. She took her grandmother's cloth and one bag, and she left at 4 in the morning. She got as far as the airport. Shin Ho-jin took her from the departures hall at Incheon at 20 past 7 in the morning. Not violently. He bought her a coffee. He sat down opposite her, and he cleaned his reading glasses on a cloth from his pocket, and he explained the situation to her honestly and courteously, and it was the most frightening conversation in this entire story. He told her he did not want to hurt her. He told her he had a granddaughter with a heart condition. He told her that he had watched 300 men grow old inside that organization, and that he intended to make sure they got paid, and that in order to do that he needed Kang Min-ho to walk into a room full of witnesses and collect his wife. Because a boss who crosses a city for a woman is a boss with a price, he said. And once the families see the price, everything else happens on its own. "I am sorry that it is you," he said. "It could have been anyone. It happens to be you." Kang came. Of course he came. And what he did when he walked into that room was the coldest thing he had ever done in his life. And I want you to notice how you feel about it. He did not fight. He walked into a room of 30 men with a Navy book under his arm, and he set it down on the table and opened it. He turned to page 4. Shin Ho-jin, 31 years of service. Wife, 2 sons, and a granddaughter, aged 6, with a heart condition whose surgery in the spring was being paid for out of that book. Kang took out his pencil, and he drew one single line through the entry. Then he closed the book. Nobody in that room made a sound, because in their world there is nothing worse than that. Not death. A man who has been struck out of the book has no protection, no pension, no history, and no claim on anybody. He does not get a call in a favor. He does not get to walk down certain streets. And Shin Ho-jin had spent 31 years making enemies, all of whom had been waiting a very long time for exactly this. Kang had not killed him. He had simply removed the roof from over his head and let the weather in. Then he walked over to where Shin was standing with a hand on Ama's arm. And he lifted that hand off her, and he laid it flat on the table. And he put his own hand on top of it. And he asked politely how the little girl was doing. And he waited for the answer. And he asked what the surgeon had said about the spring. And he waited for that answer too. He never pressed harder. He simply did not let go. Somebody's coffee was going cold on the end of the table. The strip light over the door was flickering slightly, the way strip lights do. And Shin Ho-jin's breathing came apart completely, in front of 30 men who had followed him for 3 decades. And Kang Min-ho's breathing did not change at all. You have seen this before. Act 1, a small table, a glass of water. You know exactly what this looks like. And This time he wanted it. He got her out. But the trap had worked anyway. 30 men had watched their boss cross a city for a woman. By that afternoon, every family in Seoul knew the price of Kang Min-ho. And Shin, ruined and unprotected and with absolutely nothing left to lose, had already made the call. There would be a meeting. There would be a demand. And the demand would be her. Kang had one option, and the option was war. And war meant that Navy book filling up faster than he could pay it. And at 4 a.m, on the floor of a safe house in Yangju, Ama Boateng sat with her grandmother's cloth across her knees and gave him the other one. "Close the book," she said. He said, "I cannot abandon 400 families." And she said, "I did not say abandon it. I said close it. Pay it. All of it. Every family, every obligation, in full, in 1 week, in their hands, finished. Sell everything. The hotel, the buildings, the accounts, all of it. Hand 406 families the entire remainder of what they were owed for the rest of their lives, in cash, at once, and let them go. Because that book is not just your conscience," she said. "It is your power. Every man who follows you because of what is written in it. Empty it, and there is nothing to inherit. No throne, no succession, nothing for Shin to take, nothing for anybody to want, and no reason on this earth for anyone to ever come looking for you again." He said, "It has never been done." And Ama Boateng put her hand flat on her grandmother's cloth and said, "That is the name of this pattern. It has never happened before. That is what it means. That is what it has always meant." He did it in 6 days. 6 days of Jung driving him across that city with a bag on the back seat and a list on his knee. 406 doors. Some of them cried. One old woman would not open the door at all, and he left it on the step. A man in Ilsen who had been getting an envelope every month since 2009 stood in his doorway and could not work out what he was being told. And on the last page of that ledger, in the space after the final entry, it was not his handwriting that closed it. It was hers. One line, in careful print, a debt and a family owed. Kang Min-ho. Everything. Paid. And she shut the book. Shin Ho-jin was left standing in an empty building holding a claim on nothing at all. And the last anyone saw of him, he was walking down a street in Seoul where not one single person knew his name anymore, which was the only thing in the world he had ever been afraid of, and which he had built himself, brick by brick, over 13 very patient years. The first morning in the flat above the empty shop front in Dongdaemun, there was nothing in it. A mattress for boxes and 1 chair. Ama stood at the counter eating toast because that is what she did, because 40 years of a habit does not leave you in 1 week. And Kang Min-ho picked up the only chair in that room and carried it over and set it down beside her. And then he sat down on the floor. He did not look up. He did not explain. He never explained anything. She sat down in it, and she ate her toast crying, and neither of them said one word about it. And that is the first thing I wanted you to see. The second is a folder he handed her a week later. Inside, it were the deeds to the building. Not the flat. The building. Bought 6 years earlier, 3 weeks after his mother's funeral, because it was the shop where a girl once gave a dying woman chair, and transferred into the name Ama Boateng 4 years ago. The date is printed on the page. 18 months before she ever knew he existed. The third is a thing they started doing, and they still do it. Every year, on the day Mina died, the shop closes and they mend coats. Free. All day. Anyone in that district who brings one. And into the lining of every single coat, up under the arm where nobody will ever see it, Ama sews 1 small square of Kent. There are hundreds of them out there now. Hundreds of people walking around Seoul in the cold carrying a secret against their ribs, and not one of them knows there are hundreds of others. The fourth is the wedding. The real one. A courtyard in Kumasi with red dust on everyone's shoes and plastic chairs, and her mother's entire church, and Korean elders bowing to Ghanaian elders and getting it slightly wrong and being forgiven for it immediately. And Ama wore Nana's cloth. Finished at last. And the last third of it was a mess. Uneven, heavy-handed, the tension all wrong, obviously done by somebody who was learning, because Kang Min-ho had spent 14 months teaching himself to weave off videos on a phone, and you could see it from 30 feet away. Everybody could see it. She wore it anyway. She has never worn anything better in her life. The fifth is a Tuesday, 2 years later, when she handed him her measuring tape and a paper pattern piece, and he turned it over in his hands and worked out that it was a sleeve and that it was 4 inches long. and Kong Min-ho, who had ended men's lives before breakfast without his breathing ever changing, could not hold a piece of paper still. And the last one is a Sunday, 5 years on. Rain outside, 2 languages in one kitchen, and a girl called Nana Mina, who has her father's stillness and her mother's laugh and the gap between her front teeth. The delivery man came to the door and stood there dripping and waiting. And that little girl put down what she was holding and dragged a chair across the floor with both hands all the way to the doorway and set it down in front of him. Ama watched from the counter. Kang yache da Ama. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. It had never happened before, and now it happens every Sunday. Tell me what this one did to you. Down in the comments, tell me who you thought about, and tell me the exact moment between those two that you're still carrying, because I think we all had a different one. I want to know yours. And remember this. The man who left her told the truth about who he was in front of 300 people, and he was right about himself, and she is not sorry anymore. Because the right one does not need the room to agree with him. He just walks the whole length of the aisle without hurrying. This is Afro-Korean Stories Empire. Love, the real kind, the kind that survives everything, is always, always worth the wait. I will see you in the next one.